Princess Nerys had not spoken a full sentence in 3 years. 28 royal caregivers had entered the Alpha King's palace, believing they could help her. 28 quietly packed their belongings and left. So when the palace gates opened for yet another babysitter, no one expected anything different. She wasn't a noblewoman, she wasn't a healer, she wasn't even a werewolf. She was simply a poor human named Josie. The palace servants whispered that she wouldn't last a week. But instead of trying to make the little princess speak, Josie quietly told Nerys that she didn't have to say a single word. She would stay anyway. No one realized that those 5 simple words would begin changing the loneliest child in the kingdom, then the grieving Alpha King, and eventually, the entire palace. Before we begin, like the video and subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable Werewolf Fantasy Royal stories. The palace servants had stopped asking one another how long the newest caregiver would last. After 28 failures, hope had quietly become something no one spoke about anymore. As Josie stepped through the towering entrance of the royal palace, dozens of curious eyes followed her from polished corridors and sweeping staircases. Some servants offered polite smiles, others simply lowered their heads and continued working. No one expected her to remain. Lady Morel, the palace housekeeper who had faithfully served 3 generations of the royal family, greeted Josie with practiced courtesy. Lady Morel gently welcomed her before explaining that the royal household valued dignity, discretion, and routine above everything else. Then, after a brief pause, Lady Morel quietly added that Princess Nerys valued none of those things anymore. Josie listened without interrupting. Only after Lady Morel finished speaking did Josie ask her first question. Josie softly asked whether she could meet the princess before meeting His Majesty. The request caught Lady Morel completely off guard. Every previous caregiver had been eager to impress the Alpha King first. None had asked for the little girl. Lady Morel studied Josie's face for a long moment before giving a slow nod. She silently led her upstairs. The nursery occupied the brightest corner of the palace. Sunlight poured through tall windows, overlooking endless rose gardens. Shelves overflowed with beautiful toys. Books filled polished wooden cases. A tiny rocking horse stood untouched beside the fireplace. The room looked like it belonged to a happy child. It felt like no one had lived there in years. Princess Nerys sat quietly beside the window. Her small fingers rested on a faded piece of blue fabric, Queen Lysara's favorite shawl. She never looked up. Lady Morel cleared her throat. Lady Morel gently introduced Josie as the palace's newest caregiver, before asking whether the princess would like to say hello. Silence. Lady Morel tried once more. Again, nothing. After another uncomfortable moment, Lady Morel quietly excused herself, believing the meeting had already failed. The door closed. Only Josie and the little princess remained. Josie did not move closer. She did not kneel. She did not begin asking questions. Instead, she quietly crossed the room toward a nearby bookshelf. After carefully choosing a beautifully illustrated storybook, she settled into a chair several feet away. She opened the first page. Josie softly explained that she loved stories. Then she added that Nerys did not have to listen if she didn't want to. She didn't have to answer. She didn't even have to look at her. Josie smiled gently before beginning to read aloud. Her voice filled the room without demanding attention. The story continued, page after page. Princess Nerys never spoke, never smiled, never turned around. But she never left. When Josie finally closed the book, she looked toward the little princess. Josie quietly thanked Nerys for keeping her company. Then she wished her a peaceful afternoon before leaving the room. Outside, Lady Morel waited with folded hands. Lady Morel carefully asked whether the princess had spoken. Josie smiled. Josie gently answered that she hadn't expected her to. Lady Morel seemed puzzled. Josie explained that trust was never built by asking someone to hurry through their sadness. Sometimes the kindest thing anyone could do was simply stay. Those words lingered in Lady Morel's thoughts long after they walked away. Later that afternoon, King Aldrin returned from a council meeting. His expression remained calm as always, though exhaustion rested beneath his eyes. Lady Morel met him near the great hall. King Aldrin quietly asked whether the new babysitter had already requested to leave. Lady Morel surprised him. Lady Morel replied that Josie had not complained once. Instead, she had spent nearly an hour reading to a little girl who never answered her. King Aldrin gave a thoughtful nod. He had heard similar hopeful reports before. None had lasted. He thanked Lady Morel before continuing toward his study. That evening, the palace settled into its familiar silence. Servants extinguished lanterns. Guards changed shifts. The moon rose above the palace towers. Inside her modest guest chamber, Josie unpacked only a few belongings. A folded dress, her mother's silver locket, a worn notebook filled with children's drawings from the orphan home. She placed each item carefully on the bedside table. As she prepared to rest, a faint sound interrupted the quiet. A gentle knock. Josie opened the door. No one stood outside. She glanced along the empty corridor. Nothing. Then her eyes lowered. Resting neatly on the floor lay a tiny wooden wolf. Its edges were worn smooth from years of small hands holding it. Josie looked toward the dim hallway. Whoever had left it was already gone. She carefully picked up the little carving and smiled. Far beyond the corridor, hidden behind the corner where shadows met the moonlight, Princess Nerisse watched silently. For the first time since Josie arrived, the little princess had chosen not to run away. Instead, she had taken the smallest step she knew how to take. She had shared something that mattered, and somewhere else inside the palace, without realizing why, Lady Morel found herself hoping that perhaps the 29th caregiver would be the one who stayed. The following morning, Josie returned to Princess Nerisse's room, carrying another storybook beneath one arm. She found the little princess sitting in the same place beside the window, quietly holding Queen Lysara's faded blue shawl. This time, however, the tiny wooden wolf rested neatly upon the windowsill between them. Josie noticed it immediately. She smiled to herself but said nothing. Some gifts lost their meaning the moment they were pointed out. Instead, she settled into the familiar chair, a respectful distance away. Josie softly asked whether Princess Nerisse would rather hear another story, or simply watch the clouds drift above the palace gardens together. Nerisse offered no answer. She merely turned her eyes toward the bright morning sky. Josie followed her gaze. For nearly an hour, neither of them spoke. White birds glided over the palace towers, while gardeners quietly tended the rose beds below. To anyone passing the room, it would have seemed as though nothing had happened. To Nerisse, everything had. Someone had stayed without asking her to become different. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt lonely. It felt safe. Over the following weeks, the palace settled into a quieter, gentler rhythm. Josie never measured healing by words. Some mornings, Nerisse willingly joined her for breakfast. Other mornings, she remained wrapped inside her mother's shawl, watching the world from the nursery window. Josie greeted both mornings with the same patient smile. She never celebrated progress too quickly. She never treated difficult days as failure. Healing, she believed, moved like the changing moon. It was never meant to shine with the same brightness every night. One cool afternoon, Josie wandered with Nerisse toward the royal wolf kennels. Unlike the great wolves that guarded the palace gates, the season's newest wolf pups tumbled clumsily across the grass, chasing one another beneath the watchful eyes of older wolves. Before stepping through the wooden gate, Josie noticed every palace servant pause for a brief moment. Each placed a hand over their heart before entering. Curious, Josie quietly looked toward Lady Morel. Lady Morel gently explained that it was one of Valethorn's oldest royal traditions. Long before the kingdom crowned kings, the wolves had guarded the children. Every member of the royal household still honored that promise before entering the kennels. Without hesitation, Josie placed her own hand over her heart and followed the custom with quiet respect. Lady Morel watched her thoughtfully. No one had instructed Josie to do so. She simply understood that respecting another family's traditions was another way of respecting the family itself. Inside the enclosure, one curious wolf pup waddled toward Josie, before playfully tugging at the hem of her dove-blue dress. Josie laughed softly. She carefully scratched behind the pup's ears before turning toward Nerisse. Josie quietly told the little princess that every great guardian in the kingdom had once stumbled over tiny paws just like these. Princess Nerisse watched the tumbling pups. One rolled backward into a patch of flowers before sneezing in surprise. For the briefest moment, the corners of Nerisse's mouth lifted. A tiny smile. It disappeared almost immediately. Josie pretended not to notice. Instead, she smiled back at the smallest wolf pup. Sometimes protecting a moment meant refusing to chase it. Little changes slowly found their way into palace life. One morning, Josie entered the royal kitchens before sunrise. The cooks immediately apologized, believing she had arrived with special requests from the princess. Instead, Josie gently asked whether they might bake honey bread. The elderly head baker looked up in surprise. He quietly admitted that no one had baked honey bread since Queen Lysara passed away, because it had always been Princess Nerisse's favorite. Josie smiled warmly. Josie softly replied that perhaps memories deserved to be welcomed back with warmth instead of fear. No one answered, yet every baker quietly began measuring flour. Soon the comforting aroma drifted through the palace corridors. Servants slowed their steps. Several closed their eyes. For one fleeting moment, the palace smelled exactly as it had, before grief settled inside its walls. A few mornings later, while waiting for fresh loaves to cool, Josie absent-mindedly began humming the lullaby her mother had once sung to her. She hardly realized she was doing it. One by one, the kitchen fell silent. Rolling pins stopped. Wooden spoons rested against mixing bowls. Even the crackling oven seemed quieter. The melody floated gently into the corridor. Lady Morel appeared in the doorway. Her eyes glistened. When Josie finally noticed everyone watching, she looked embarrassed. Josie softly asked whether she had disturbed the kitchen. Lady Morel slowly shook her head. Lady Morel quietly replied that the palace had forgotten what music sounded like. Then she offered words that none of the servants would forget. Sometimes a home begins healing long before the people inside it realize their hearts have already opened. No one spoke after that. No one needed to. King Aldrin remained unaware of most of these quiet changes. His days were consumed by petitions, border reports, trade negotiations, and meetings with alphas from neighboring territories. Yet every evening, something felt different. Fresh flowers had quietly returned to forgotten windows. Servants no longer whispered every conversation. Even the palace wolves seemed more relaxed, often sleeping peacefully beneath the eastern courtyard, instead of pacing through the night. He never questioned why. One evening, while passing the family dining room, an unfamiliar sound stopped him. Laughter, soft, brief, uncertain. King Aldrin froze. The sound came again. He stepped closer. Through the slightly open doorway, he saw Josie helping Nerisse shape little wolves from bread dough, while supper baked nearby. One crooked little wolf collapsed onto the table. Josie laughed first. A heartbeat later, Princess Nerisse laughed too. The sound lasted only a few seconds. Yet to Aldrin, it felt as though someone had quietly opened a window inside a house he believed would remain closed forever. He remained where he was. He dared not interrupt. That same afternoon, another quiet moment spread through the palace. One of the youngest kitchen servants accidentally dropped an entire basket of eggs. The frightened girl burst into tears, convinced she would lose her position. Before anyone else moved, Josie knelt beside her. Josie gently assured the young servant that accidents happened to everyone. Then, she calmly helped gather the broken shells herself. The servant apologized over and over. Josie smiled kindly. Josie quietly replied that broken eggs could always be replaced. People could not. From across the room, Lady Morel watched in thoughtful silence. Years of serving the royal family had taught her something few people understood. Kindness, offered when no reward could possibly follow, revealed a person's true nature. Later that evening, King Aldrin happened upon Josie, comforting the same servant outside the kitchens. She listened far more than she spoke. When the young woman finally smiled through her tears, Josie simply wished her a peaceful evening before quietly walking away. King Aldrin remained standing beneath the stone archway. For the first time since Josie had entered the palace, he stopped seeing her merely as the woman hired to care for his daughter. He found himself wondering who she had been, long before she ever walked through the palace gates, and for reasons he could not yet understand, he hoped one day he would learn the answer. By the time spring settled over the kingdom of Valethorn, the palace no longer carried the same heavy silence. No one could remember exactly when it had begun to change. It simply had. Fresh flowers once again rested beneath tall windows, where empty vases had gathered dust. The library fire burned every evening. The kitchens prepared cinnamon biscuits because Princess Nerys now enjoyed shaping little wolves from the dough before they were baked. Servants no longer hurried through corridors with lowered heads. Some even lingered long enough to exchange smiles before returning to their duties. No proclamation had ordered these changes, yet everyone quietly understood where they had begun. Princess Nerys still had difficult days. Some mornings she waited outside Josie's room before sunrise, the little wooden wolf tucked safely beneath her arm. Other mornings she refused breakfast and remained wrapped inside Queen Lysara's faded blue shawl. Josie welcomed both mornings with equal patience. She never praised the brighter days too loudly. She never treated the quieter ones as setbacks. Whenever Nerys chose silence, Josie simply remained beside her with a book, a basket of wildflowers, or quiet embroidery resting across her lap. Her presence never demanded conversation. It simply promised that someone would still be there when the silence ended. Little by little, Nerys stopped fearing silence because she no longer feared facing it alone. One warm afternoon, Josie suggested visiting the palace library. Towering shelves stretched toward painted ceilings filled with the history of Valethorn. Ancient chronicles rested beside children's fairy tales. Royal records shared the same shelves as handwritten legends passed down through generations of alphas. Princess Nerys wandered slowly between the shelves, before stopping before an oversized storybook decorated with silver wolves beneath a full moon. She reached for it. The heavy volume slipped from her hands. Before it could strike the floor, another pair of hands caught it. King Aldrin. He smiled gently before placing the book back into his daughter's waiting hands. Princess Nerys looked up at him. For one quiet heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, without speaking, she stepped a little closer. Not into his embrace. Not yet. Simply closer than she had stood beside him in years. King Aldrin's eyes softened. Across the aisle, Josie quietly turned her attention toward another shelf, allowing father and daughter a moment that belonged only to them. From that day onward, King Aldrin joined them whenever the responsibilities of the crown allowed, sometimes for only a few minutes, sometimes for an entire afternoon. He listened while Josie read stories. He watched Nerys sketch flowers beside open windows. He accompanied them during gentle walks through the palace gardens, where the royal wolves often wandered freely among blooming roses. One evening, as the first full moon of spring rose above the palace, Lady Morell quietly explained another royal tradition. Every full moon, the royal household gathered in the moon court, not for ceremony or spectacle, but to remember those who had gone before them. Stories were shared. Children listened. The wolves rested peacefully nearby. It reminded every generation that strength without memory eventually became pride. Josie joined respectfully, saying very little. She simply listened as older servants recalled Queen Lysara's kindness, while Nerys quietly smiled at stories she had never heard before. For the first time, remembering the queen no longer filled the evening with unbearable sorrow. It filled it with gratitude. Later that night, Princess Nerys woke from a frightening dream. Josie hurried to the nursery after hearing soft footsteps outside her room. She found the little princess sitting awake, clutching the wooden wolf tightly against her chest. Without asking questions, Josie simply wrapped a warm blanket around Nerys's shoulders and sat beside her until the trembling slowed. Together, they watched moonlight spill across the nursery floor. Eventually, Nerys drifted peacefully back to sleep. As Josie quietly left the room, she found King Aldrin standing alone in the corridor. He had heard none of the conversation. He had only seen the calm that followed. For several moments, neither spoke. Then King Aldrin quietly invited Josie to walk with him toward the palace balcony overlooking the eastern gardens. The moon illuminated the sleeping kingdom below. King Aldrin remained looking toward the horizon before finally speaking. King Aldrin quietly admitted that he feared something more than grief itself. He confessed that there were mornings when he struggled to remember the sound of Queen Lysara's laughter. What frightened him most was not losing her. It was fearing that time might slowly erase the little things that had once made her feel close. Josie listened without interrupting. She offered no comforting speech, only quiet understanding. After a long silence, Josie gently replied that perhaps memories never truly disappeared. Sometimes hearts simply became too wounded to hear them clearly, and sometimes, when love and peace slowly returned, the memories found their way home again. King Aldrin looked toward her. For the first time since Queen Lysara's passing, someone had spoken to his grief without trying to solve it. Neither said another word. They simply stood together beneath the moon until the palace bells marked midnight. Neither realized that something precious had quietly begun between them, not romance. Trust. Several days later, Josie and Nerys wandered through Queen Lysara's rose garden. The first blossoms of spring had opened across the climbing vines. Princess Nerys suddenly stopped beside a weathered stone bench. She carefully brushed away a few fallen petals before sitting down. Josie noticed the familiar sadness resting inside the little girl's eyes. Instead of steering the conversation elsewhere, Josie gently asked whether the queen had enjoyed sitting there. Princess Nerys gave a small nod. Silence lingered between them. Then, almost as softly as the breeze, Princess Nerys whispered one word, "Mama." The single word carried 3 years of longing. Josie's eyes filled with quiet emotion. Josie softly replied that Queen Lysara must have loved this garden very much. Princess Nerys nodded again. This time she did not cry. Instead, one careful sentence at a time, she began telling Josie how her mother used to count the first roses that bloomed every spring. It was not a long conversation, but it became the longest one Nerys had shared since losing her mother. That evening, King Aldrin found Josie arranging fresh roses inside the family sitting room. He quietly observed the flowers before speaking. King Aldrin admitted that no one had placed roses there since the queen passed away. Josie respectfully lowered her eyes. Josie gently explained that she had asked Princess Nerys whether the room should remain empty forever. The princess had chosen the flowers herself. King Aldrin remained silent. His gaze lingered on the roses. Finally, he thanked Josie before quietly leaving the room. Outside the doorway, he paused. For several slow breaths, he simply stood there, preparing himself for a future he had never believed possible. Days later, during supper, Princess Nerys accidentally spilled berry juice across the tablecloth. She froze immediately. Her shoulders tightened. She reached for a cloth, expecting disappointment. Instead, King Aldrin chuckled. The sound surprised even him. King Aldrin smiled warmly, before telling Nerys that Queen Lysara had once spilled an entire pot of tea across the very same table during their first winter together. Princess Nerys blinked, then she smiled. Father and daughter quietly cleaned the table together. Across from them, Josie lowered her eyes, allowing the moment to belong entirely to them. Later that night, King Aldrin visited the palace infirmary. Dr. Tavian looked up from the medical journal resting before him. Without ceremony, King Aldrin admitted that smiling again felt strangely disloyal. He feared every joyful moment carried him farther away from the woman he had loved. Dr. Tavian closed the journal gently. The physician quietly answered that grief never asked people to stop loving. It simply asked whether they were brave enough to keep living. King Aldrin said nothing. Yet those words remained with him long after he returned to his chambers. Meanwhile, another letter arrived for Josie. Unlike the cheerful drawings usually sent by the orphan children, this letter carried worrying news. Heavy winter storms had badly damaged the orphan home's roof. Food supplies were running low. Several younger children had become ill. Without help, the home might soon close its doors. Josie carefully folded the letter and slipped it inside her satchel before anyone else noticed. Throughout supper, she smiled exactly as she always had. No one saw the quiet worry hidden behind her eyes. No one, except Princess Nerisse. Late that evening, while carrying fresh linens toward Josie's room, the little princess noticed the door standing slightly open. Inside, Josie knelt beside her small travel bag. She wasn't unpacking. She was quietly folding several dresses and placing them inside. Princess Nerisse stood frozen in the corridor. Her fingers tightened around the little wooden wolf she now carried everywhere. Without making a sound, she slowly stepped backward. For the first time since Josie arrived, fear returned to her eyes. Because to a child who had already lost her mother, a packed bag could mean only one thing. The following morning, Josie requested a private audience with King Aldrin. Lady Morel quietly escorted her to the king's study before closing the heavy oak doors behind them. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, stretching across maps, royal decrees, and neatly arranged reports that covered the great desk. King Aldrin immediately noticed the folded letter resting in Josie's hands. Before she spoke, he sensed the conversation would carry more weight than either of them wished. Josie lowered her eyes respectfully. Josie sincerely thanked the king for welcoming her into the palace, and for entrusting her with the greatest treasure in his life. Then, she carefully placed a letter upon his desk, her resignation. Silence settled between them. King Aldrin unfolded the single sheet and read every word. When he looked up again, his voice remained calm. King Aldrin quietly asked whether someone inside the palace had treated her unkindly. Josie immediately shook her head. Josie gently assured him that everyone had shown her generosity and respect from the day she arrived. King Aldrin asked whether caring for Princess Nerisse had become too difficult. Again, Josie answered no. After gathering her thoughts, she finally explained. The orphan home, where she had spent years raising abandoned children, had fallen into desperate hardship. Winter storms had damaged the roof. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted. Several of the youngest children had become ill. She had accepted the palace position for only one reason: to earn enough money to keep those children safe. Now, they needed her presence far more than they needed her wages. King Aldrin listened without interruption. When she finished, he quietly offered to double her salary. Josie smiled sadly. Josie gently replied that no amount of money could comfort frightened children who believed they had been left behind. Someone needed to stay beside them, just as someone had stayed beside Princess Nerisse. King Aldrin slowly lowered his eyes. For the first time, he realized Josie had never measured responsibility by titles, only by people. Several moments passed. Finally, he folded the resignation letter. King Aldrin quietly thanked her for her honesty. Though every part of him wanted to ask her to remain, he simply replied that he would never stand in the way of someone choosing compassion. It was the hardest permission he had ever given. Later that afternoon, Josie and Princess Nerisse wandered through the palace gardens beneath the warmth of early spring. The palace wolves rested peacefully beneath flowering trees, while young wolf pups chased one another through patches of sunlight. Princess Nerisse smiled as one playful pup rolled into a bed of daisies. Josie laughed beside her. For anyone watching, it looked like another ordinary afternoon. Only Josie knew she was quietly memorizing every path they walked together, every flower, every laugh, every moment she would soon have to leave behind. From a distant balcony, King Aldrin watched them. He noticed how easily servants now smiled when Josie passed, how confidently Nerisse reached for her hand, how naturally laughter belonged inside the palace again. He suddenly realized something that unsettled him. He could still remember the palace before Josie arrived. He simply no longer wished to return to it. That evening, Josie crossed the western corridor, on her way to her room. Ahead of her stood King Aldrin. He paused before a familiar door, Queen Lysara's chamber. For several quiet moments, he rested one hand upon the carved wooden frame without entering. Finally, he unlocked the door and disappeared inside. Josie stopped walking. Lady Morel quietly approached from behind. Seeing Josie's thoughtful expression, the housekeeper spoke gently. Lady Morel explained that the king still visited Queen Lysara's chamber almost every evening, sometimes for only a few moments, sometimes until long after midnight. Josie thanked her softly before continuing down the corridor. That night, sleep refused to come. She lay awake, replaying the image of King Aldrin standing outside that door. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge what had quietly grown inside her own heart. She cared for him, not because he wore a crown, not because he ruled a kingdom, because she had come to know the lonely father hidden beneath the Alpha King's responsibilities. The realization frightened her. She quietly reminded herself that grief deserved patience. Perhaps the kindest thing she could do was leave before either of their hearts mistook gratitude for love. The following afternoon, Princess Nerys seemed unusually quiet. She followed Josie through the palace without speaking. She barely touched her lunch. Even the wolf pups waiting eagerly by the gardens failed to draw her usual smile. When Josie suggested reading together, Nerys gently shook her head. As evening settled over the palace, Lady Morel hurried into the drawing room, her usually composed expression marked by concern. Lady Morel informed Josie that Princess Nerys had disappeared. Within moments, the palace stirred into urgent motion. Guards searched every corridor. Servants checked every chamber. Captain Garrick organized search parties across the palace grounds, without alarming the visiting nobles. King Aldrin searched personally. Every passing minute tightened the fear growing inside him. Josie stood perfectly still. Then she remembered. Only days earlier, Nerys had spoken about counting roses with her mother. Without hesitation, Josie hurried toward Queen Lysara's abandoned rose garden. The old garden remained untouched by ceremony. Climbing vines embraced weathered stone walls. The restored bench overlooked the first roses of spring. Curled quietly beside it, sat Princess Nerys. She hugged the little wooden wolf tightly against her chest. Josie approached slowly before sitting beside her. She offered no questions, only her presence. Several moments passed. Then, Princess Nerys lowered her eyes toward the roses. Her voice trembled. Princess Nerys quietly asked whether everyone always left. Josie's heart ached. Josie gently answered that sometimes people had to leave places, but love did not always leave with them. Tears gathered in the little girl's eyes. She finally looked at Josie. Then she whispered the words she had carried inside her heart for years. "Please, don't leave me too." Hidden beyond the flowering archway, King Aldrin had just reached the entrance to the garden. He heard every word. He remained where he stood, unable to move. In that single moment, he finally understood. His daughter had not spent 3 years fearing grief. She had spent 3 years fearing abandonment. That night, after Josie gently tucked Nerys into bed, she quietly returned to her own room. The moment the door closed behind her, the strength she had carried for everyone else finally gave way. She sat at the edge of the bed, covering her face as silent tears escaped. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Josie admitted she no longer knew what the right choice was. One group of children needed her because they had no one else. Another child needed her because she had finally learned to trust again. No decision felt kind. No decision felt fair. She remained there until the tears slowly faded into silence. A soft knock interrupted the stillness. When Josie opened the door, no one stood outside. Only a warm cup of tea rested on a small wooden tray. Beside it lay a simple note in Lady Morel's graceful handwriting. "You do not have to carry every sorrow alone." Josie held the note close to her heart before quietly closing the door once more. Elsewhere inside the silent palace, King Aldrin walked alone through the western corridor. His footsteps eventually stopped outside Queen Lysara's chamber. For 3 years, he had stood before that door countless times. Tonight, he slowly turned the handle. For the first time since the day he lost his wife, King Aldrin walked inside. The following morning, King Aldrin requested no council meetings. Trade agreements remained unopened. Military reports waited untouched upon his desk. For the first time in many years, the affairs of the kingdom could wait. There was something far more important he needed to understand. Lady Morell found him standing beside the library windows before sunrise. Without looking away from the awakening palace gardens, King Aldrin asked her a quiet question. King Aldrin wondered where Josie had learned to care for children with such patience. Lady Morell admitted she knew very little about Josie's past, only that she had spent years helping raise orphan children in a small village several days beyond the capital. King Aldrin nodded thoughtfully. Then he made an unexpected decision. Rather than asking Josie to remain, he asked whether he and Princess Nerys might accompany her home. Josie looked genuinely surprised. Josie gently explained that the orphan home was small, weathered, and nothing like the palace. King Aldrin smiled faintly. He quietly replied that he had not come to admire buildings. He wished to understand the woman who had quietly changed his daughter's life. The journey lasted 2 peaceful days. Princess Nerys spent much of the carriage ride nestled beside Josie, reading stories aloud with growing confidence. Each page she finished felt like another victory over the silence that had once imprisoned her. King Aldrin listened quietly. There were moments when he found himself smiling without realizing it. This time, he did not feel guilty. Instead, he silently thanked Queen Lysara for teaching him that love always began at home. When the carriage finally reached the orphan home, Josie's expression softened. The building stood exactly as she had described. Its roof still bore the scars of winter storms. The garden fence leaned unevenly. Several windows had been repaired with mismatched timber. It was humble. It was imperfect. Yet before the carriage came to a complete stop, the front door flew open. Children raced across the yard with joyful cries. Not one of them looked toward the royal carriage. Every pair of eager eyes searched only for Josie. Little arms wrapped around her, tiny hands reached for hers. One young girl proudly displayed a patchwork doll Josie had sewn months earlier. A boy hurried over carrying a carved wooden bird, eager to show how carefully he had painted it. Another child excitedly announced that the vegetables Josie planted before leaving had finally begun growing. Josie greeted every child by name. She remembered birthdays, favorite stories, small promises she had made before leaving. She knelt so every child met her eyes at the same height. King Aldrin watched quietly. No royal welcome he had ever received had carried such simple, unquestioning love. For the first time, he understood that respect could be commanded. Love never could. The orphan home's elderly caretaker warmly embraced Josie before respectfully greeting the king. After exchanging pleasantries, King Aldrin gently asked how long Josie had worked there. The caretaker smiled kindly. She quietly answered that Josie had never truly worked there. She had simply stayed. Years earlier, when illness swept through neighboring villages and left many children without families, Josie never asked whose responsibility they were. She simply became theirs. Whenever food grew scarce, she quietly gave away her own portion. Whenever frightened children woke during the night, they always found her sitting beside them before their tears had fully fallen. The caretaker's voice softened. She admitted she had long ago stopped counting the lives Josie had changed, not because the number was small, because kindness had a way of multiplying beyond anyone's ability to measure. King Aldrin remained silent. Across the yard, he watched Princess Nerys laughing freely with children she had met less than an hour earlier. Then, like dawn breaking quietly across the horizon, understanding settled within him. He had believed Josie transformed the palace. Standing there, he finally understood the truth. The palace had never changed Josie. The palace had simply discovered the woman she had always been. Before leaving the village, several familiar faces approached the king. To his surprise, they were members of his own palace staff. The young kitchen servant Josie had comforted weeks earlier smiled shyly. She revealed that she had grown up inside the very same orphan home. Soon afterward, one of the stable hands stepped forward, then a palace gardener, then one of the junior footmen. Each quietly shared the same story. Josie had encouraged them, comforted them, taught them, believed in them long before anyone else had. King Aldrin listened without interruption. When the final story ended, He looked back toward the orphan home. A kingdom remembered great rulers, but ordinary people remembered those who stayed when leaving would have been easier. It was the first time he truly understood the difference. The return journey passed in comfortable silence. Princess Nerys fell asleep, with her head resting against Josie's shoulder, the little wooden wolf still tucked safely beneath her arm. King Aldrin watched them quietly. After a long while, he finally spoke. King Aldrin admitted that he had spent much of his life believing strength alone protected a kingdom. Now he believed something different. Kindness protected what strength never could. Josie smiled softly. Josie gently replied that children rarely remembered the size of a home. They remembered the people who made them feel safe inside it. Neither spoke again. Some truths became complete the moment they were spoken aloud. Several days after returning to the palace, royal messengers departed from Valethorn in every direction. This time, they carried no declarations of war, no new taxes, no political decrees. Instead, King Aldrin established a permanent royal foundation to support orphaned children throughout the kingdom. Every orphan home would receive food, medicine, teachers, and funds for repairs. When Lady Morell heard the royal announcement, she quietly smiled. The kingdom believed its king had changed. She knew something deeper had happened. Compassion had finally found its rightful place beside the crown. That evening, King Aldrin invited Josie for a walk through Queen Lysara's rose garden. The flowers bloomed beautifully beneath the fading sunlight. They walked without speaking, until they reached the old stone bench. King Aldrin stopped there. He looked toward the roses before turning to Josie. King Aldrin quietly thanked her, not for healing the palace, not for restoring laughter, but for reminding him that loving again did not require him to love Queen Lysara any less. Love, he had finally learned, did not replace. It expanded. After a long, steady breath, he spoke the words resting quietly inside his heart. King Aldrin gently asked whether Josie could imagine building a future with him and Princess Nerys. Not because the kingdom expected another queen, not because the palace needed saving, but because somewhere along the journey, the three of them had already become a family. Only one thing remained unnamed. Josie stood silently for several moments. Emotion shimmered gently in her eyes. Finally, she answered with complete honesty. Josie admitted that she loved them both deeply, but she never wanted gratitude, loneliness, or grief to decide something as important as marriage. She asked for time to be certain that what they shared had been built upon hope, not upon loss. King Aldrin smiled warmly. He gently replied that love worth keeping had never feared waiting. Several weeks passed. Nothing between them was hurried. Nothing was forced. Then one bright spring morning, Lady Morell looked toward the palace gates. A familiar figure walked slowly up the stone pathway. Josie. She carried no travel bag, no employment papers, only the little wooden wolf Princess Nerys had once left outside her bedroom door. Lady Morell smiled before quietly opening the great palace doors. This time, Josie had not returned because she had been hired. She had returned because she had finally chosen home. Summer arrived gently across the kingdom of Valethorn. The palace still stood beneath the same towering walls. The same banners danced above its highest towers. The same wolves guarded its ancient gates. Yet everything within those walls felt different. The silence that had once settled over every corridor had quietly given way to something warmer. Music drifted from open windows during the evenings. Servants laughed together while preparing meals. Fresh flowers decorated rooms that had remained untouched for years. Even the palace wolves no longer wandered the gardens alone. They now rested peacefully among visiting children, accepting gentle hands behind their ears, as though they, too, understood that the palace had finally become a home again. Princess Nerys had changed the most. She still carried the little wooden wolf wherever she went. She still visited Queen Lysara's rose garden every week. She still missed her mother, but grief no longer silenced her. Instead, it became part of the stories she lovingly shared. One afternoon, while helping Josie arrange fresh roses inside the family sitting room, Princess Nerys carefully held a white blossom before smiling. Princess Nerys quietly admitted that she could finally remember her mother's laughter without feeling as though her heart would break. Josie gently squeezed the little girl's hand. Josie softly replied that love never asked people to choose between yesterday and tomorrow. The heart simply learned to carry both. Standing unnoticed outside the doorway, King Aldrin heard every word. For the first time since Queen Lysara's passing, he smiled without guilt. Life settled into a rhythm that no longer needed effort. King Aldrin no longer hurried through every meal because duty demanded it. Instead, he protected breakfast as carefully as he protected meetings of the crown. Some mornings they discussed books Princess Nerys had discovered in the royal library. Other mornings they simply watched the palace wolf pups chase butterflies through the gardens. Ordinary conversations slowly became the family's greatest treasures. No one searched for happiness anymore. It quietly found them. Several months later, King Aldrin invited Josie to walk with him through Queen Lysara's rose garden once again. The climbing roses had fully returned. Butterflies drifted lazily between blossoms. The old stone bench stood beneath flowering branches, exactly where Princess Nerys had once whispered the words that changed everything. King Aldrin paused there. He looked toward the blooming garden before turning to Josie. King Aldrin quietly admitted that for years he believed loving again meant leaving part of Queen Lysara behind. Now he understood something entirely different. Love never divided the heart. It gently taught the heart to grow. He looked into Josie's eyes. King Aldrin softly asked whether she would marry him. Not because the kingdom needed another queen, not because the palace needed saving, but because every ordinary day had become brighter simply by sharing it with her. Josie's eyes shimmered with quiet tears. She smiled. Josie gently answered that she would. The royal wedding took place beneath the first full moon of summer. According to one of Valethorn's oldest traditions, every new royal marriage was blessed beneath moonlight. The same moon believed to have watched over the kingdom's first alpha family generations before. There were no extravagant celebrations meant to display wealth. Only those whose lives had become part of their journey gathered within the palace gardens. Lady Morell, Dr. Tavian, Captain Garrick, the palace servants, the orphan children who had once called Josie home. Princess Nerys walked proudly between her father and Josie, her small hands holding theirs with unmistakable joy. When the vows had been spoken, an ancient silence settled across the gathering. One by one, every alpha present lowered his head, not before a queen, not before a king, but before a family newly joined beneath the oldest traditions of the pack. It was Valethorn's highest blessing, one that could never be commanded, only earned. Josie bowed her head respectfully, deeply moved by a tradition she had come to cherish rather than inherit. That evening, after the final guests departed and the last lanterns flickered softly across the gardens, peace settled over the palace once more. Princess Nerys wandered beside Josie, while King Aldrin followed only a few steps behind. Near the old fountain, they met a young girl visiting from one of the kingdom's orphan homes. The child curtsied politely, before looking curiously toward Josie. The little girl quietly asked Princess Nerys whether the beautiful lady beside her was the new queen. Princess Nerys looked toward Josie, then toward her father. A radiant smile spread across her face. Without the slightest hesitation, Princess Nerys proudly answered that she was my mother. Time itself seemed to pause. Josie's eyes immediately filled with tears. She slowly knelt before Nerys. Neither of them spoke. They simply embraced. King Aldrin quietly looked away for a brief moment, overcome by emotion. When he finally looked back, he gently wrapped his arms around them both. No royal title, no ancient blessing, no crown could ever equal those 4 simple words. She is my mother. As twilight settled across the palace, musicians quietly played beneath open balconies, while servants carried away the last of the wedding flowers with smiling faces. The palace no longer felt like a place that remembered only sorrow. It had become a place where children ran freely through its gardens, where laughter echoed beneath its stone arches, where every meal was shared, where every memory was welcomed, and where love was never measured by blood alone. King Aldrin stood beside Josie as they watched Princess Nerys race across the grass with the palace wolf pups, weaving happily around her. Above them, the full moon illuminated the ancient kingdom that had witnessed both its deepest grief and its greatest healing. For years, Valethorn had admired its Alpha King because he ruled with strength. Now, it loved its royal family because they ruled with compassion. And beneath the peaceful chorus of wolves welcoming the summer moon, the palace no longer stood as a monument to loss. It stood as living proof that the strongest families were not always the ones bound by blood, but the ones who chose one another every single day. Years passed gently across the kingdom of Valethorn. Every spring, the palace gates opened to welcome orphaned children from every corner of the realm. They did not arrive as recipients of charity. They arrived as honored guests. The tradition had begun with Queen Josie and soon became one of the kingdom's most cherished celebrations. Children spent their days exploring the palace gardens, reading stories in the royal library, and laughing beneath the watchful eyes of the palace wolves, who seemed to understand they were protecting something precious. Visitors often admired King Aldrin for the peace and stability that marked his reign. But whenever they asked what had truly changed the kingdom, the answer was always the same. It began with kindness. Queen Josie never sought praise for the royal foundation that transformed countless orphan homes throughout Valethorn. She simply continued visiting them, remembering names, celebrating birthdays, and listening to every child with the same patience she had once shown a lonely little princess. Princess Nerys grew into a compassionate young woman whose greatest strength was neither royal birth nor werewolf heritage, but the quiet understanding that no child should ever wonder whether they were loved. On the first day of every spring, she still carried the little wooden wolf that had once rested outside Josie's bedroom door. It reminded her of the smallest act of courage she had ever found, the courage to trust someone again. One peaceful afternoon, the royal family wandered through Queen Lysara's rose garden together. The roses bloomed more beautifully than ever before. Near the restored stone bench stood a single white rose bush, planted in Queen Lysara's memory. Josie carefully placed fresh flowers beneath it. King Aldrin stood quietly beside her. Princess Nerys slipped her hand into Josie's. No words were needed. No one had replaced Queen Lysara. No one had forgotten her. Love had simply grown around the place she left behind. As the three of them walked slowly beneath the flowering arches, palace servants smiled from nearby windows, grateful to witness a home that had once been filled with silence now overflowing with peace. And beneath the rising moon, the palace no longer stood as a monument to loss. It stood as proof that hearts broken by grief could learn to love again, not by forgetting yesterday, but by choosing hope, one ordinary day at a time. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, drop your comments, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story.